What's up, RotoBallers? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jorden Hill, and today we're going to be talking about some players that have been underwhelming for fantasy purposes this season and whether or not it's time to panic about them. We'll get into the reasons why you should be worried about these players or why you shouldn't and what to do with them. But first, make sure you subscribe to the channel to keep getting fantasy advice throughout the season. Let's start off with J.K. Dobbins, running back for the Baltimore Ravens. Now, of course, Dobbins missed all of 2021 with a torn ACL, and he returned in Week 3 of this season. He had a pretty big fantasy day in Week 4, but he's been mostly inefficient on his touches, and he had his knee tighten up in Week 6, clearing the way for Kenyon Drake to see a lot of the carries in the second half. I'm definitely concerned about Dobbins, and I do think it's time to panic a little bit. Gus Edwards should be returning to the team in just a couple weeks, and at that point I think we can project a 50-50 timeshare between the two backs, who will definitely yield some opportunities to Lamar Jackson. Now, Dobbins is still 100% worth rostering for his upside, he just can't be relied upon as a weekly RB2. Although he should be a good flex play at some point this season, you might just want to bench him until he proves he's fully healthy. The next running back we'll discuss is KAREEM Hunt of the Cleveland Browns. Hunt got off to a hot start in Week 1, and he scored a touchdown last week, but he bottomed out with 4 carries for 12 yards in Week 6. Now, I'll say right off the bat, I'm really not that worried about KAREEM Hunt. Nick Chubb in this game only saw 12 carries, and that's a really low number for him. The Browns just really weren't able to get it done on the ground against the New England Patriots, and they got blown out in this game. I expect Hunt to get back on track next week and see his normal workload of about 12 to 15 touches. He's a good running back. He should be able to produce with that amount of volume. The final running back we'll talk about is James Robinson of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Robinson suffered a devastating Achilles tear last year, and it was surprising that he was able to suit up in Week 1 of this season. He got off to a really hot start through the first 3 weeks of the year, but he's kind of tailed off over the past 3. He's seen a dip in efficiency and his opportunities dwindle, and he's losing a lot of snaps to Travis Etienne, who has been the far more explosive runner over the last 3 games. With 2 consecutive games with over 100 yards from scrimmage, I do think Etienne is clearly the main running back you want for fantasy purposes going forward. Robinson needs to stay on your roster, but unfortunately, he's kind of just a bye-week fill-in at this point, or maybe an injury replacement if necessary. The first wide receiver on our list has really disappointed a lot of fantasy managers this year, including myself. It's DJ Moore of the Carolina Panthers. Moore has topped 50 yards receiving just twice this season, 5 receptions only once, and he only has 1 touchdown through the first 6 games. He had his worst performance of the season on Sunday, totaling just 7 yards on 3 receptions, with PJ Walker and Jacob Eason under center. You could blame the quarterback play for this one game, but the chemistry between Moore and Baker Mayfield hasn't been there all season, so unless Moore gets traded, I really just can't see his situation improving. Maybe the Panthers decide to start Sam Darnold at QB when he's healthy, but you know it's time to panic if that's what you're rooting for. The Panthers are fielding trade calls for some of their veterans, but Moore is reportedly highly unlikely to be traded ahead of the November 1st deadline. I would hang on to Moore in your fantasy leagues until at least that deadline passes, just to make sure he doesn't get traded to a team like Baltimore or maybe somebody else that's in desperate need of a wide receiver. But as long as he's on the Panthers, you really can't put him in your starting lineup anymore. Let's talk about Michael Thomas. Thomas looked like his old self in the first 2 weeks of the season, but he suffered a foot injury in Week 3 and he hasn't played since. My concerns for Thomas are purely injury related, but they're certainly there. He's only appeared in 10 games since the start of the 2019 season, and he missed all of 2021 with an ankle injury. Hopefully, he's able to return next week, so I wouldn't give up on Thomas just yet, especially with all the injuries the Saints are dealing with in their wide receiver room. I'd be willing to throw him back in my lineup as soon as he's active, but if he gets hurt again, it might be time to panic. Let's take a look at New York Jets receivers Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson. Starting with Moore, the second-year man has failed to reach 8 PPR fantasy points in any game this season, and he saw 0 targets from Zach Wilson in Week 6. Although he doesn't have any noteworthy showings, at least the target volume was there for Elijah Moore through the first 3 games with Joe Flacco at the helm. Ever since Zach Wilson took over, the amount of passes per game has went down dramatically, and Wilson simply isn't looking Moore's way. We've reached full-blown panic levels with Elijah Moore. He can be dropped in all redraft leagues. A lot of the same can be said for rookie Garrett Wilson, who saw target numbers of 8, 14, and 11 with Joe Flacco through the first 3 weeks. Those numbers have dipped to 6, 4, and 5 with Zach Wilson. The yardage hasn't been there, the touchdowns haven't been there. It's really just been a struggle for this passing offense all around. If you're in a shallow league with a hot commodity on waivers, I really don't mind the idea of dropping Wilson, but if you can afford to keep him on your bench, I think it's worth it because we've seen the upside. The last player we're going to talk about is Darren Waller, tight end for the Las Vegas Raiders. Considering the fact that he was drafted as a top 5 fantasy tight end, he hasn't lived up to the hype at all. If you were unfortunate enough to start Waller in Week 5, you were treated with a 0 in your starting fantasy lineup because he exited early with a hamstring injury. The Raiders are on bye this week, so maybe that'll give Waller the rest he needs, and we'll see how he fares against the Houston Texans in Week 7. It's a good matchup, so hopefully he can bounce back. If Waller comes up short again, though, I will be very panicked. Obviously, you can't drop him given the current landscape of the tight end position, but I would be trying to shop him for a tight end with lesser name recognition that's actually producing. Who are some players you're panicked about? Make sure you let us know down below. Thanks for tuning in, leave a like if you enjoyed, and best of luck in Week 7.